You probably have seen the news. Many international students and their parents are quite nervous after these anti-immigration protests here in Australia, and obviously they have valid concerns whether Australia is still a safe study destination or not. Let's break down in this video what's happening and what's the ground reality. Is Australia still a safe study destination or not? We'll try to answer that in this video. Just to give you context, my name is Sam. I've been living in Australia since 2006. I moved as an international student myself, and now I run this online platform for international students, which is Overseas Students Australia. So as I have been living in Australia for quite a long time, I would share my experiences as well in terms of safety and how it feels to live here. So first, let's talk about what's happening in terms of these protests here in Australia. So on 31st of August 2025, these protests for March for Australia happened across major capital cities here in Australia. Now the rhetoric or the message behind these protests were anti-mass immigration, which was not about immigration itself, but rather mass immigration, which is having too many people coming into the country, which is seen as a reason for housing crisis, cost of living crisis, and in general infrastructure collapse for services like hospitals and education, especially for locals. And majority of the people who attended these rallies were in support of migration, but not mass migration. However, certain groups like white supremacists and neo-Nazis were involved in these rallies as well, and these groups are just anti-immigration altogether. They don't want any immigrants to come to the country, and they were heavily criticized by all media outlets and by the government as well, as some of the flyers used for these rallies were quite racist, and as I mentioned, these were heavily criticized by pretty much everyone across the board, which was good to see, as the organizers were saying that they were only doing it for anti-mass migration, not just anti-migration. But as I mentioned, there were few parties in the group that were actually pushing for anti-migration instead of anti-mass migration. Now, just to give you a bit of context, the migration numbers in Australia has been declining for the last year or so. Government has been introducing policies which are helping to decline these numbers, whether it's international students or other migrants. So the net migration numbers, if you look at these charts, are certainly in decline. And there is a decline in student numbers as well, as you can see in this chart. However, there's a very small uptick in the year 2025. Now, just to be clear, most of this debate regarding the migration protests is around general migration, not specifically about international students only. But international students are caught in this debate, whether how much migrants or international students should be allowed to come into the country. As I said, for those people who don't know, there is a limit of number of students who can come into the country, and there is a limit on permanent migrants in Australia as well. And trust me, this is quite a lengthy and a tough process, especially if you are a skilled migrant trying to get into Australia based on your skills. I've been through this process myself, and it is a lot of work. And I completely understand, because you need to meet the criteria to get your permanent residency. Now, should the parents and students be worried about studying in Australia? Again, parents have a valid concern, especially for students who are already studying here, or parents who are planning to send their kids to Australia for studies in the near future. Whether Australia is still a welcoming country, what will be the job prospects after completing their studies, and will it affect their studies at all? Now, I'm going to give you a bit of reality check here, that majority of the international students have no issues of studying, working and living in Australia, even though after these protests has happened. See, as I said, Australia is one of the most safest countries in the world, and generally speaking, majority of the Australians are quite welcoming. Obviously, there are some minor clashes in these protests, but majority of these protests were quite peaceful. And protests in Australia are legal. People protest for many different reasons. And certainly, there is no consistent rise in targeted violence toward any international students or for a particular community. But in general, the perception does matter. So we understand that students sometimes may feel uncomfortable about this, and headlines can cause stress among the families back home. But giving you an overall picture, is Australia still a safe destination for students? I would certainly say yes. Australia still is one of the top destinations for international students to study. The quality of education is still very good. There are post-study work opportunities available for international students, and campuses for universities in Australia are quite vibrant and multicultural. There are policy changes that the government is trying to bring in, like increase in English test score requirements, cap on student visa numbers, and in generally there is a rising cost of living here in Australia, which international students also have to face. You have to keep those things in mind when you're planning to study here in Australia. That does it still serve your purpose of studying abroad? But in terms of safety, Australia is still quite a safe destination. However, if you are a student in Australia, here are some practical tips that will help you to keep yourself safe. So based on my personal experiences and experiences of other students, one of them would be to avoid these protests or large gatherings. So for example, on 31st of August, we suggested many students to avoid these areas as there might be some clashes that could happen. Luckily, there were not many, except one or two in Melbourne. But my suggestion would be to avoid these large gatherings or public protests wherever you can. Also, stay up to date with any news from your university or from media outlets here in Australia. If there is a safety concern, I also suggest you to save emergency number, which is 000 here in Australia, and also save numbers from your local embassy as well. If you are traveling at night, my suggestion would be, if you can, travel in a group or with your friends, and try avoiding going to certain areas at certain time of the day, which can cause some issues. So basically use common sense wherever you can. Now, if you need support as a student, there are a lot of support channels available, especially from your university. So my suggestion would be to reach out to your university regarding the support channels available there. And if you are a concerned parent or a student who's planning to study here, you can always ask universities in Australia what sort of support system they have available if such situation arises where they need to get some help. Most of the universities do have a support systems available, so that shouldn't be a big issue. And one last thing will be regarding the advice for parents. And here is my advice for the parents who are planning to send their kids to Australia. One thing I highly recommend any parent to do is to regularly connect with your kids, especially not just academically, emotionally as well. You need to check in if they are doing okay or not. Encourage them to be part of the community groups and make sure to teach them to stay informed regarding what's happening in terms of the news updates for these protests and things like that. And when choosing a university, you should always speak to university regarding their support programs as well. What sort of support systems universities offer to their students? That might help you in case you need to use these support systems. And last but not the least, help your kids book the accommodation nice and early, either in university campus if that's more safer for you, or in a safe neighborhood. Now, giving my own personal perspective on all this, yes, these protests were quite divisive in nature. There were many attributes which I didn't obviously like. I actually never saw these sort of protests happening ever in my life here in Australia so far. This was first time experiencing such thing in Australia for myself as well. But generally speaking, over the last 19 years of my life here in Australia, there hasn't been much issues. People are generally quite nice, welcoming. I only had one incident of a racist comment given by some random person on the street. Apart from that, it has been quite peaceful and safe here. And I don't deny the fact there might be some racist people out there who will make these comments, who will try to say something to you. The best thing you can do is to ignore them and move on. And if you feel unsafe, you definitely should be calling 000 or calling police. But majority of the Australians are not like that. Now, just to give you a quick summary, that yes, there are tensions rising among the local communities, especially in terms of housing crisis, cost of living, and other infrastructure issues. But they are not directly targeted toward the migrants or international students. Rather, majority of them are just upset with the government of the day. They just want a better system for their kids and for their families, which I can understand why they are saying it, but I personally think it could have been done differently. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts regarding this in the comment section below as well, so highly encourage you to do so. Also, we have a free student guide if you would like to download it, and all the other useful links will be in the description box as well, so feel free to check them out. Hope you like this video. If you have any question, again, feel free to ask in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. See you in the next one.